At the start of this year, I was heading back to Chicago for the second semester of my university degree. And while I should have been spending more time on that degree, I was frantically taking calls between classes, pitching to investors, or telling my professors I had week-long illnesses to travel around everywhere from Miami to Europe to West Africa, building my startup with my co-founder. Since then, we've gone full-time. And over that time, one person's been particularly close to our journey. Our first and closest advisor, Andrew Savage. And today, I'm in conversation with him. The past year, more than anything, with the experiences it's given me, has given me time to think. And this podcast is a collection of my thoughts and the ideas of my guests. So, without further ado, a quick introduction before the video recorded episode with Andrew Savage. Andrew Savage is a VP and founding member at Lime, a multi-billion-dollar startup named as one of the top 100 most influential companies by Time magazine. In fact, in most major cities in 5 continents around the world, you'd be hard-pressed to go a couple of hundred meters without seeing a Lime bike or scooter. Andrew's also previously worked as a campaign lead for President Obama and Senator-elect Peter Welch. His journey, from rural Vermont to pushing innovative change on the global stage, more than anything exudes a wealth of experience and counsel, but to me personally, and my co-founder, he's been an advisor to us at our company, Arda, for almost a year now. Such has been our relationship, that when I finally pulled the trigger to launch this podcast, I had no doubt in my mind that Andrew should be its very first guest. At every turn, he's reminded me of what's important while growing a business. And as someone like me, and many of you who don't have technical backgrounds, how one can go about creating grassroots change through working with individuals, creating stories, and spreading value. It's something he's all too used to, as Lime has grown to 250 cities in 5 continents, with a total of over 250 million rides in just 5 years. It's a special story, and I think there's much to glean and to confront. In this conversation, we start from Andrew's true beginnings, growing up in a self-sustaining environment in rural Vermont, and his journey into the public sector and to Congress. I tussle with Andrew's ideas on sustainability and how Lime's at the forefront of changing the way we move in cities. And we'll talk about the challenges of growing a business, influencing society and problem solving through innovation and leadership. As will be in future episodes of this podcast, there are times we disagree. For example, while I tend to fall on the skeptical side on the environmental issue, aligning my views with the likes of Bjorn Lomborg, I always value the opportunity to illuminate the shadows of my thoughts in conversation. I treat my ideas as malleable, modular, and as such they evolve through time. And these conversations are just a glimpse into that process. And similarly, as you'd expect, there are times Andrew and I agree, and there are core beliefs we share. And in that way, this podcast is a way of critiquing the world we live in, by sparring with ideas, dancing with them. And while these guest podcasts, by dint of their nature, primarily focus on my guests' ideas rather than my own, you can hear more from me directly via my Substack writing, artwork, or future episodes of this podcast, all linked in the description. As you'll be able to tell, this episode is the first of this podcast. There are an abundance of moments which I know I fall short on. Moments where I'm caught in hesitancy or stutter, moments where I could allow for a smoother flow, challenge more, or redirect in a truer manner. Episode by episode, I'll keep improving and will always listen to you well. So, without further ado, let us go to the place between shadows and light, with Andrew Savage and I. Andrew, it's wonderful to have you here as the first guest on this podcast. We started our journey about a year ago now at Harvard Innovations Lab, and since then you've become a really close advisor to Jan and I at Arda, helping us through some tough challenges, but really helping to forge our progress. So, firstly, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's great to be with you. I'm excited to have the conversation.
Yeah, no, it should be awesome. Such has been your journey from public policy to being part of the founding team of a multi-billion-dollar company that has transformed urban culture. That we'll have plenty to talk about. But before we get on to let's say your conventionally defined career, I wanted to start by asking you about what gives you your fuel. Your career, though perhaps more focused on its principles, societal impact, and communication, has been diverse in its structure, journeying from the public sector to, as I said, Lime, one of the biggest startups and companies in the world. Um, what is it about you that makes you see the world in the way you do, and confront it in the way you do?
Yeah, I knew you were going to come in with a curveball right off the bat.
Start
A tough
strong.
one,
Why
but
not?
yeah, start strong. Well, no, I'm happy to chat about it. And again, thanks so much for having me on. It's been actually a real pleasure to work with you and Jan, and I'm happy to have this conversation as well. I definitely think about the foundation that I have just as a person as fueling a lot of the work that I do today professionally. I grew up in a pretty rural area of Vermont where we really had a lot of self-reliance going on. My family, for example, cut all the firewood that we needed for the year, which was 8 to 10 cords of wood. It wasn't all the heating fuel that we had, but just that process, from felling a tree to cutting it up to loading it in the truck to bringing it up the hill to unloading it to bringing it into the basement to then restacking it and to then ultimately having it end up in the furnace in the basement. That type of thing, which you could replicate in many other facets of my upbringing, really instilled a sense of place, but also a sense and an ethic toward sustainability and caring for the land. And we didn't turn the thermostat up in the house without thinking about all that effort that it took to heat the house. And it also brought my family and I together. I can't say that I loved all the hard work. I'm sure as a kid I was a pain in the butt at times getting out there and doing the work, but it also instilled a real sense of family and a sense of work ethic. And I think those three things, the land ethic, the family ethic, and the work ethic, have been things that have stuck with me. And I think there's probably threads from that throughout my career, and I hope throughout my life as a person as well outside of my career. And it certainly has been something that's instilled my interest in public policy and in public policy's impact on my community, as well as my interest in sustainability and doing something about climate change. So I think that's a decent place to start to give you a sense of kind of what it looked like as maybe a younger person before my professional career, which led into obviously the professional work that I've done.
Yeah, amazing. And we'll pick up on a lot of those themes as we go, I'm sure, especially coming to the sustainability piece. Um, and well, with the fact that that upbringing uh, is reality still for so many around the world, and it is so core of people's lives around the world. But as you said, coming on to the start of your career, and the public sector, um, you started working in communications for who is now Senator-elect Peter Welch, and also later for the Obama campaign. Um, you also then went on to become a deputy chief of staff in Congress. Um, I've always found political campaigning and rhetoric to be somewhat sticky, if I'm being completely honest, and I think that holds true for quite a lot of people. What I think should be messaging based on public policy outcome and individual encouragement and enablement can quickly descend into propaganda. Um, what lessons did you learn about creating value through communication, and stories about connecting to people from those more political days that you've taken with you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I would say that I was really only interested in politics from the get-go in that it related to the community that I cared about. And it wasn't getting into politics for the sake of politics as a sport or as a business or any of the other things that politics can be for other people. But it was really all about serving and being part of service for a community that I cared about. And I was very, very lucky to stumble upon a then Senator Welch, who later became Congressman Welch, State Senator Welch, who became Congressman Welch through the campaign work that you referenced, that I was on that campaign, and then followed him to Capitol Hill, who now, as you noted, is back to Senator Welch. It took me some time. He's U.S. Senator Welch. So it was an amazing journey working with him, in part because he was so focused on politics, not for the sport or for anything grander. It was really for serving the community. And I know it feels very cliche to say that, but I think there are people still in it for the right reasons. And it really instilled in me a faith of why politics can matter. And to your, more appropriately to your question, or specifically to your question, why communications matters. We really worked hard to communicate his priorities, to communicate the things that he was working on, but also receive communication from Vermonters as we were, in Washington, for example, or running for Congress. It's so important to be good listeners. And so it's a true two-way street if you're doing it right. And I think it's something that is often lost in the world of politics and campaigning, but is super important. And one of the reasons that I think being on the early Obama campaign, um, why that felt so important and felt so pivotal was that I think he brought a different sense of national politics to the equation, and clearly was very successful at that, in communicating to new people, to new voters, and also communicating about issues in a different way that really brought them down to, or accessible to, people with whom they impacted. And so, I think there's a lot to politics that is incredibly valuable, especially as you think about the role that it plays in everyday life.
I'm really glad you brought that up because if I give you my opinion, I think the way politics has moved over the past few years, it's got too remote, too
Mm.
bureaucratic, and too top down at the central national level. And I think that's really not a direction we should be going in. And a lot needs to be done to reverse that. Um,
Yeah, I just want to add a point there,
yeah,
not to interrupt you
no, no,
as
of
the
course.
host, but I think your point about being remote is a fascinating one. And before this U.S. election, where there were a ton of election deniers running, and there was a lot of fear about what those election deniers would do if they lost their own local election, whether they were running for governor or secretary of state, et cetera. Um, I thought, and I was having a maybe Pollyannish approach to the conversation with a number of political friends. I had this feeling that that remoteness goes away when you get more to the local level. It is really hard to deny an election when you're in that community, or you've lost and you have to go face people at the grocery store. And I think that is one of the fundamental differences between what we've seen in the last 2+ years in the United States at the federal level, where it is very remote, and the distinction when it becomes more local. And my hope is that, to your point, that we get away from some of the remoteness and have more of the in-person stuff, because I think that's where you get the real interactions that have real value.
Right. I mean, the interesting thing I find there is that it's affected both sides of the aisle. I mean, your classical conservatism, a more sort of liberal conservatism, is tending towards small state, limited governance. But even as you mentioned, even the right, especially in America, has really got caught up in well, as the left has, in in controlling big state and national agendas in a really blanketing way. Um, and yeah, as you say, um, we need to really move back to the local level. But coming back to Lyme, and how the communications lessons that you learned transpires into your work at Lyme. We know Lyme wasn't the first micromobility solution. That's no secret. London's had Boris bikes for a number of years, and I think you can trace bike sharing all the way back to the 1960s in Amsterdam. But with
Mhm.
companies like Climate in the past few years, we've really seen a boom, and I think that's down to a cultural shift uh, amongst all else. So linking back to those lessons and your early days in communication, how does that influence the way you and Lime go about trying to change culture and behaviors at the societal level?
Yeah, I mean, we really needed to communicate something new and total and not I wouldn't say totally different, but technologically different to the cities, the early cities that we wanted to serve. You're right that the idea of bike share or mobility sharing has existed for some time in different forms and different functions. But what really changed right around the 2017 era when Lime was founded was a technological shift. The fact that you could have a GPS unit in these shared bikes, later scooters, and people could access them widely through having a smartphone. Those two things didn't exist several years prior to that with Ubiquity. And what we needed to do was communicate a vision for a technology, which was the ability to have free floating or what was called dockless bike share at the time, and now scooter share. We don't even hear the term dockless anymore, but that was what we were trying to communicate to cities in 2017 about the value that could be had if you didn't require a rider to pick up or drop off a bike at a certain location or station. And what we were really trying to do is reduce the friction that was being caused by those stations. And knowing that, for example, in New York City, huge swaths of the city had absolutely no bike share because the operator didn't find the value or wasn't ready to invest in those communities. And so, what we were bringing was a different solution, and it was a solution based on technology, but it also required us, and it was one of my chief roles to communicate to cities about a different vision. And that was a vision for decarbonizing transportation, making it more affordable, making it more accessible, and thinking about it in a different way. And it also involved us talking about the things that they may perceive as a negative to our service. I mean, you hear about, and we're not going to, I'm happy to dive right into it, around, the clutter of dockless bike share or scooter share. Now, there's absolutely no question that parking could be improved in many situations, and there's many technologies and solutions that we put in place that have done that. But it also involved demystifying the notion that um, it's okay to see a scooter or bike where you hadn't seen it before. We accept cars all the time in places that we don't want them. If you go around cities and take note, you'll see cars double parked, illegally parked, et cetera, down the list. And we had to communicate a new vision for cities and also had to raise the flag on what are we up against and what are we helping solve. And perhaps the status quo isn't quite as good as folks are perceiving it to be. And there was actually a great study in early on in San Jose that looked at um, parking infractions of our bike and scooter service versus parking infractions from cars, and it actually showed cars were uh, far more in violation of the vehicle code than dockless bike share at the time. So I know that's a long-winded way of saying that, how, talking about how communication was vital to the business's founding, but it played obviously a very central part.
Right, and picked up on it slightly. But to what extent do you think that that technological spark that happened in a moment in time links to, for example, the boom of Uber? And how do you sort of see how do you see that trend of micromobility and the transition that's happened in urban mobility?
I mean, I think we're a bit on the coattails or the tailwinds of, the Ubers of the world, in that people became used to hailing transportation in cities in a different way, uh, primarily through a smartphone. But we're also a solution to Uber, where people were sold and told, particularly I'm thinking about cities here, but more broadly as communities, that Uber and Lyft and other services might help reduce car use and transportation problems because you wouldn't have to own a car. That hasn't really transpired, and we actually have been and found we've been a partner of Uber's, but we've also found that we can supply trips that they otherwise would have been providing. And so you see a significant mode shift from Uber's, Lyft's, ride hail, taxi across the globe in the 200 plus markets where we operate. And that's a real benefit, where you can see people taking a bike or a scooter, which weighs 40 kilograms, versus a car which was weigh 2, 3, 4 tons, and obviously the carbon implications of that. And so, I would say both tailwinds and solution to the technology that's been emerging in cities.
Right, and we'll come on to onto the entrepreneurship and innovation side of things later in the conversation. But I think, as you picked up on there, there's an important and perhaps rather contentious and frictional conversation to be had about sustainability and specifically environmental sustainability. Um, After your work in Congress, you moved into the private sector and especially the energy industry. From my limited but nevertheless eye-opening work in the public sector, and for anyone who might have had the exhilarating joy of working with a committee or an agency, a public institution, um, one quickly realizes that that world is oftentimes quite slow, uh, process rather than outcome driven, and bureaucratic. The old adage, bureaucrats make bureaucracy for a living, I find holds very true. Um, but what change did you have to make as an individual going from the public sector to the private sector? And what parts of yourself did you really have to look at and adapt?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you a brief story of what led me to leave the public sector first, because I think it's a perfect segue around the pace of change. I was actually working on the Hill for Congressman Welch at the time, and we had, and this was part of my portfolio, developed a program called Homestar, which was a national home retrofit program, energy efficiency that would have helped improve home efficiency and reduce emissions. And we had built this dream coalition. We had, on one hand, the National Association of Home Builders, uh, industry like Dow, Owens Corning, Home Depot, Lowe's. They were all on board because it was good for business. And at the same time, we had the League of Conservation Voters and all the environmental groups and labor on board because it was good for jobs and good for the environment. We had this dream coalition. Never had a bill been scored the same way by the National Association of Home Builders and the League of Conservation Voters. And President Obama endorsed the bill, and he invited us all out to a Home Depot in across the river. I believe it was in Alexandria or Fairfax, and we had not even crossed the river back to Capitol Hill to find that Mitch McConnell, then the Senate leader, had said it's dead on arrival because it would create jobs and was too good for President Obama's reelection. At that moment, I realized, wait a second, why am I spending time on Capitol Hill when I could be doing work on the same issue in the private sector where we could move faster and not have as many obstructions? And that's not to say that the good work that folks do and need to do on Capitol Hill today shouldn't be happening. It's vital. People have got to keep fighting the fight. But for me, 4 years was enough. I was ready to do it in the private sector. And it was important for me to be doing work that had impact, that pursued the similar sustainability and climate mission that I was on, but that could move a bit faster. And I think it was a fairly natural transition. I mean, the energy sector, and in this case, the renewable energy sector, I was working in solar, and in some cases, we developed a few wind projects. Um, that industry is very much linked to government and regulation, and we had to find a way to navigate regulations and had to find a way to build a business and an industry around the existing regulations and think of ways to tweak the regulations to make them better, to be able to grow a bigger industry. And I found that incredibly fulfilling because growing a bigger renewable energy industry felt right up my alley and right up the mission that I have hoped to guide my career around.
Right, and you've given me the perfect runway here.
Uh-oh.
Because if you allow me to be candid and honest for a minute,
Of course, yeah.
I'm quite skeptical as to the way on the national level that climate change has been perceived and consequently how we've gone about solving it.
Mm.
Um, I really think that to a great extent we've lost a lot of nuance in the conversation, and deep-rooted climate alarmism has caused irresponsible government spending and regulations and red tape that really don't get us anywhere. Um, and resources that are spent that could be spent on other pressing issues around the world. Just to name a few, that there's still 1.5 million people dying from TB in the developing world every year, where we've got a hold of it in the rich world, and and the cold deaths that are greater than the heat-related deaths. Um, but climate change is obviously certainly a problem. But I think the irresponsible role government has played, um, has, for me, wasted a lot of resources with very little benefit. And the solution, as I come to, lies in innovation. And I really think that's the way we're going to get somewhere in the long run, and make permanent change that takes people with us. Um, so, for example, solutions to the way we move within our urban environments, to scientific advancements, to the way we extract energy. I think that's really the way we're going to forge our way forward. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's elements there that, I mean, there's so much we could dive into there, but I think in many ways, government has been in the way of effectively addressing climate change because we haven't, and this isn't just the United States, but in many other countries, been able to break away from the old systems and the entrenched industries and interests. We should not be providing tax breaks to oil, gas, et cetera, when they're established industries. Have been stood up. They certainly need more innovation, but they don't need more money. And so I think there's cases where you can see climate action um, slowed or diverted because of not being willing to make the right or appropriate trade-offs in terms of prioritization. And you listed a number of pressing global challenges, health challenges that are real. And if you're not addressing each of the challenges effectively, you aren't able to have the resources to be effective, right? So if you're wasting money on oil and gas, for example, you're not able to spend it on TB, or you're not able to spend it on renewables, et cetera. So I think there's clearly a ton of examples where we could have been doing better and stoking better innovation on climate more effectively. And I think there's examples where things are going better, and then there's examples where we still just aren't making headway fast enough.
Yeah, I mean, just looking into the data, I think the road that we have been on has actually, over the past century, if we look at it on that scale, has been a positive one, a really positive one, and I think that gives some clues to the action we should be taking now. Climate related deaths from climate related disasters are down 99% over the last century, um, and the impact on GDP that climate will have is is minuscule. That's not to say that it's not a problem that needs addressing, but I think we really need to pull people with us. So, especially at Lyme and your work there, how do you go about tackling this issue in a way that brings people with you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one question for you around just jumping back to the climate related deaths. I
Yeah.
mean, is that climate change induced deaths must be higher because climate change has really accelerated in the last few decades, but you're probably citing broader sort of climate impacts, sort of the environmental impacts versus climate change related impacts.
So
Is
I
that
think that
right?
that's deaths from natural disasters caused, climate-related natural disasters. So hurricanes, heat waves, droughts, floods, the sort.
Right. So we on one hand might be more resilient to natural causes, but I'm curious if we parsed the impacts of climate change related deaths, what that would look like over the sort of the more recent period. Now I think, for example, compared to 100 years ago, if you had a enormous snowstorm across the Northeast, 100 years ago, you probably would have expected a few climate deaths. I'm curious to know the difference between those climate deaths from 100 years ago versus climate change related deaths from a hurricane that sweeps up, the east coast of Florida, et cetera. It'd be an interesting sort of study to understand
Yeah,
those
yeah, absolutely,
impacts.
absolutely.
You asked a bit about how Lime thinks about climate change, and really it is so central to what we do. And I know it's pretty easy for a company to say, "Oh, climate change is the top reason that we're in business." I actually think with Lime, it really is. Um, I'll be very candid that in the first 2 years of the company, 3 years of the company, it was a very dormant muscle for us. The sustainability practices, like we were, fighting for survival, for growth, and I think. Companies that are in the very early stages are should be and can be afforded a bit of leeway because it's really hard to do everything all at once. And I think as a founder yourself, you'll probably experience this with Arda, that you can't possibly be perfect on all fronts, and Lime was not perfect on all fronts. In fact, we weren't that great on the sustainability.
Right, and we've jumped around quite a bit on the Lime front, but sort of just to rein it in and bring it back to the beginning, because that's something we haven't yet talked about. Talk me through the earliest days of Lime. Um, I know you mentioned the sustainability piece came later, um, but talk me through those early days of trying to break through in new markets. I know that was initially on university campuses as well. Um, what was the atmosphere like at Lyme when it was founded? If I was there with you guys, what would it feel like? And what was the vision that kept you guys going?
Yeah, it was tough. I won't lie to you. I won't sugarcoat it. I mean, it was a really tough environment where we had uh, competitors that weren't all that differentiated from us, clamoring to get into markets that we were also trying to get into, and it was not clear at the time who was going to get into what markets, or even what how cities were going to decide um, who would get in or not get in. And so, right around the beginning half of 2017, when we were just doing bikes, it was a bit of the Wild West. There were no regulations. There was an expectation that we not do things similar to what Uber and Airbnb had done a few years prior, where they would just go into cities and ask for forgiveness. There was an expectation that we not do that because cities didn't want it, and also because our product is so visible in markets. So it's pretty hard to sort of build a presence without being known when you have a bike that is bright green. Um, so there was a lot of competition to find markets, and I actually loved it in that it allowed me to use the communication skills that we talked about earlier, the understanding of government, to try to figure out ways to get into markets. And one of my favorite markets was getting into LA first in the micromobility space. We built a relationship with a city councilor who really wanted mobility and was willing to sort of take us on in his district, and had enough prerogative within the city to say, I will welcome them to my district, and we don't have to wait for full city approval. And it was those types of sort of navigations that were happening all across the country at the time, of finding ways, whether it was college campuses, different DOT directors, for example, in Seattle, that were really welcoming, or city councilors. And it created an environment very much like a campaign environment too, where you were really having to be scrappy. There weren't a lot of processes or well established paths, and it made it a lot of fun, but it was very, very difficult. And I think the industry grew up a lot. I think Bird came along later in 2018, and that sort of accelerated growth, and also accelerated the levels of challenges that were being had with cities, because they were moving a bit faster than we were comfortable. And ultimately, we've had to focus on other things to build a very strong business, and the strongest micromobility business in the space. And we could certainly talk about what that looks like. But there were some divergences where companies would go out of business because they couldn't figure out how to do the government relations. And there were divergences in how companies could operate, and did operate, to become a more profitable business, which is the path that we're now on.
Let's talk about that. Why is Lime winning? Why are you winning?
Um, I think a bit of a laser focus on operations. What we realized pretty early on, and didn't necessarily immediately execute on, was how important the service and the operations were going to be. This wasn't a situation where you could just deploy a fleet and then hope for the best. We had to hire and train a team and build practices that allowed for the business to succeed. And we're still on the path of seeking EBITDA profitability. EBITDA profitability. I think we'll get there, and that has been our intent. But it has only come after really realizing the sort of the fundamentals were so important. If you think about how difficult, and we've talked about this a little bit, the service is. I mean, we're really running a logistics company, because you have the consumer facing app that people see when they want to, snag a scooter or bike. But then you have the Lime app, which allows us to do things like hotspot deployment, and understand what vehicles need to be repaired, or what vehicles need to be charged. We have a third platform which allows fleet partners, logistics partners, to do the same, where we can tell them hotspots where we want them deployed. We can give them a sense of what needs to be picked up and what needs to be deployed in some markets where we use that model. all of that to say, it's a really complex business that required a significant amount of logistics understanding. And I think we invested in that. And I think we stayed laser focused on that. And ultimately, we were able to do growth and focus on operations at the same time to be able to scale the business to where we are today. And I think in the end, we will see. I think there will also be a significant amount of consolidation in the industry because in many markets there simply can't be as many players as there are today, and have it worked effectively.
Right, and it's something we've discussed privately between us quite a lot because I mean that's really a lot of where the relatability between Lime and Arda comes in, and we're seeing a lot of the same things in the drone industry despite its relative um, infancy, let's say, to the micromobility industry. But how do you see your work at Lime influencing your competition? What do you think, especially given the economic situation at the moment, what do you think that companies within your space are going to have to look at in particular? And how, in these situations, do you go about identifying problems and addressing them on a really broad, company wide, large scale?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how companies influence each other, I think there has been a pretty good up leveling because of the competition. And maybe the operational stuff that I just mentioned, it happens behind the scenes. But some of the stuff that's on the front end is really important. Things like introducing a swappable battery that allows for you to reduce the amount of vehicle miles traveled just to manage the fleet. That came about and became more widespread because of competition. Every company wanting to do it the best way. And yeah, there's some economic benefits behind the scenes, but on the front end of the business, cities and key stakeholders were seeing a more efficient operation. So you could sort of replicate that across many scenarios, and sustainability is certainly one of them, where I think each company that has wanted to be credible with cities has had to continuously up level the work that it's doing on the sustainability front. It's what led us to bold climate goals and setting a science-based target and a net zero goal. It's led us to renewable energy for charging in warehouses, the whole myriad of things that we've done as a company. And I think often when you're able to, from a sort of systems change perspective, relate the things that will help grow the business to the things that you need to get done to be competitive. When you can make those two and two connections, it certainly accelerates the ability to get them done. And with cities as our primary stakeholder, giving us literally often the license to operate, and riders being our riders, right? Incredibly key stakeholder. With both of them, riders and cities asking for something like sustainability or high quality hardware, high uptime, things like that. It really forces you to up level the work as a business. And I think we're held in account for that as well. And so it's been actually nice that even if it's been hard, that there's been alignment between the things that cities and riders want, and also leading towards a profitable business. They're not mutually exclusive. They're sort of running right in parallel.
Right, and talk me through some of the ways in which Lime uh, gauges its user base and its riders, um, and uses that to influence what you do at the company. Because there's an interesting dynamic at Lyman and with us at Arda as well. You cross the city barrier, the regulation and regional barrier first, and then only the riders come into play. But once you cross that barrier, what's that relationship like with the rider? How are you gauging information from them, and how are you responding to them?
Yeah, I mean, we do a significant amount of rider surveys to understand both the practices that our riders are taking, and why they're taking a scooter or a bike and what they're using it for, but also to understand their pain points. And that feedback directly ties to things like hardware design. We now have a larger front wheel on our scooters. It's a more with curved handlebars. If you've seen them out in markets where you are, it's a more comfortable experience. And that stuff comes straight out of rider experience that we glean from them. And we also learn a lot about what they want to see of us as a company. And I think living the mission and being a sustainable company is something that we hear from riders all the time. So you're right, you have to get past that city threshold to even have the ability to operate. But then really your primary customer is your riders. And I think it's led us to things like lower friction ability to grab a scooter or bike from the Uber app, where we're now integrated in the Uber app. So someone can say, hey, you know what? This mile-long trip or 2 kilometer trip, I just don't want to take a car for that. It's going to be $13. I'm going to take a $4 scooter. So things like that we learn from riders all the time. And if we're not listening, obviously we're not growing and adapting to what riders want us to be doing.
I'd like to ask you for some advice, if I may. In every startup and business, as you know, and as I know, and as many others will know as well, you often find yourself with your back against the wall, and especially when you're a founder, a lot of the brunt you bear is personal, and it influences your life. Um, how do you deal with those setbacks at work, and how do you stop them influencing your personal life? We'll come on to COVID in just a second, because I know that was a particularly challenging time and place for Lime. But on a more personal side, how do you deal with setbacks, and as someone who's so core to a company, and who's been there right from the start, it feels like it's your baby. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it maybe seems a little bit cliche, but really staying grounded in the rest of your life, because you will not be successful if it's the only thing that you're doing. And, right around the time of Lime's founding, we had our second child, my son, who's now a whopping almost 5.5 years old, which is somewhat shocking to me. Um, Getting home for them was always the highest priority of the day. I didn't care what else was going on, what kind of traffic I would sometimes have to fend off in the Bay Area. I'm glad to not be there anymore. It was always that Lime was part of what I was doing and never all of what I was doing. And I think it's really hard to pull off. I think it's candidly why I've been able to continue doing the work and be at a high growth, fast-paced company for so long, is that I think I've always kept it in perspective. I've tried to stay healthy and get exercise and not have it sort of bear down on living a well-rounded life. And I think family and fitness and are two of the things that I've sort of kept near and dear and never lost sight of, despite all the craziness that was going on, particularly around the sort of highest growth periods for the company.
Right, and COVID was a particular challenge for Lime, as it was for many other companies, with a lot of cities adopting, for good or bad, strict guidelines on mobility, on social interaction,
Right.
and livelihoods. I think it's stated online. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but you had to pause about 99% of your market operations, and had to lay off 14% of your workforce during this time. How do you get through that as a company?
Yeah, it was brutal. I mean, I remember, we get daily reports on from every market what has transpired the previous day, trips per day, revenue, all the whole bit. And to go from we were probably a month away from being free cash flow positive. If you picture COVID hitting the first week in March, that's right when seasonality kicks in for our seasonal business, and we would have been very likely free and clear and cash flow positive. Instead, as you noted with your good research, which I'm not surprised about, we shut down everything other than South Korea. And it was brutal, because to be one step away from an enormous milestone as a company to then literally fearing for the loss of the company, it was really tough. It was really tough to think about all the hard work vanishing, being that close to a critical milestone. It was really tough to let go of employees who were friends, had been through the trenches. And, in some ways, once we got through that, it did allow us to double back on how do we run this business well? How do we run this business profitably? And honestly, and this might sound a little bit trivial, but, how to make sure that all the hard work that we and even those who had left the company prior, either because of layoffs or just left prior for other reasons, that there was a sort of a legacy there, that we could actually have built something that would have staying power and have the impact that we all wanted it to have. So, in part, I think we're now sort of in whatever act this is. I would say it's at least Act Two, but maybe more if you sort of slice it a few different ways, because we've added different vehicles to the mix and geographic, expansions. Wherever we are today, it's really all about seeing this through so that we actually have the impact that we want to have, and candidly the staying power as a new industry.
And just wrapping up, something that's really relevant to me in particular, your work with impact startups. Um, what does it do for you to be able to have a key, enclosed, and influential role in startups, to be continuously a part of that scene? Um, and what value do you see in people coming up with an idea and running with it?
I mean, the value that I get is I love startups. I love the creative thinking. I love the idea that virtually anything is possible. And I know that through the experience at Lime, there's a lot of lessons learned, good and bad, that could be helpful to the next startups in line. Like, we need these companies out there, especially in the impact space and the climate space, and social innovation space, to be successful, to keep having a prosperous and good world. And I love the idea of being able to help. I get energy from it as much as I contribute back. And it's just so important that those who have really exciting ideas can find help and find funding and be able to get some flight and see if the ideas stick. And we know not all startups succeed. That's fine. That's part of the business. But we need some of them too, because with that, we get a much better world.
Right, absolutely. And as a closing question, I hope to make this a bit of a tradition, but we'll see. We'll see where it ends up.
Oh.
Maybe your answer will define that.
No
But
pressure.
what
No pressure.
adventure? No pressure at all. No pressure at all. What adventure are you currently on?
Oh, man. I think it goes back to living a balanced life. I love the adventure of Lyme, but it does not fully define me. And my goal is to keep finding micro adventures along the way. I do a bunch of bike racing, and I do a bunch of familying and dadding, and I love all of those. And I hope to keep having parallel adventures along with the professional adventure.
Amazing. You'll have to tell me about the bike racing scene in Vermont sometime.
Happy to.
Andrew, it's been a real pleasure. I mentioned at the start, but the work we've done together over the past year has been special, and I know I can speak for Jan as well. It has really impacted both of us in a really positive way, and it's been great to find out more about your career, your journey, your life, and I'm sure that there's a lot to take away from it. So thank you again for taking the time.
Yeah, of course, and likewise, I wish you guys the best of success. I'll be there right along the way, and I'm excited to see what's to come for you guys as well.
Amazing.
Thank you.